The historic material you are about to see has been preserved and distributed as a public service by Laclede Gas. 2,000 people taking care of more than 1 million customer inquiries, making more than 400,000 service calls, adding to 12,000 miles of pipe. Laclede Gas, bringing you energy that is comfortable, efficient, and virtually pollution-free.
They are gone now, the last paddle turned, the last whistle long since blown. But 1 century after the fact, St. Louis still remembers. And sooner or later, on a holiday or Sunday's drive, we all go down to the levee and wonder what it was like. When the steamboats lined the bank for a solid mile from Carr Street to Chouteau. When St. Louis was the Queen City of the West. When the Olive Street horse car was a new idea in rapid transit. When Washington University was a 4-story enterprise on 17th Street. And Jim Eads Bridge was the butt of 100 jokes. The years when peace was celebrated in a beer garden. Until a bloody civil war turned the city into an armed camp and the river to an artery of war. Well, in the next hour, we're going to tell the story of those years. We're on the deck of the Pathfinder, one of a fleet operated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to maintain the river channel and to help protect river cities against flood. But for the next hour, the Pathfinder is going to be a sort of a platform from which we can take a look back to the days of its side-wheel ancestors, when instead of steel decks and diesel engines, the riverboat was a palace in 1/4-inch pine. When St. Louis was the starting point and final destination of a polyglot nation on the move. And when history was around the bend, moving toward St. Louis. The summer of 1859 was the most prosperous year the river had ever seen. Even the flatboats made a profit on their one-way trip to the south. Loaded with livestock and whiskey, they would sell the boat for lumber at New Orleans and take passage on a steamboat back upriver. In that summer, the steamboats were the transportation marvel of the age. Between them, they hauled over 4 million tons of freight. And despite cutthroat competition, almost every boat that summer carried a crowd of passengers going north.
It was my first journey to St. Louis since I had sold my cotton there in the summer of '47. Surrounded by young people for whom this was a romantic interlude, I felt very old indeed. In those times, men and women didn't mingle freely, but like small children at the dancing school, we were separated by sex. The ladies were confined to the stern, where they were furthest from the heat of the boilers and the danger of explosion. The cabin was an illegitimate Gothic style, covered by a patina of dirt, fingerprints, and tobacco stains. Our principal diversion was the bar, where a brandy smash made the food bearable. It is difficult for a civilized person to describe the dinner. Everything was served at once. From ignorance, many of my companions began their meal with a cherry tart and ended with turkey. Everything was covered by a coat of grease. At the time, I didn't see how I would survive the journey.
The steamboat officers had their own quarters on the Texas deck, above the passengers. Their luxuries were modest, but the pay was good, and for most of them, the river was both an occupation and a way of life.
I went on the river as fireman, and in them days, a steamboat boiler was as liable to put you in heaven as it was in St. Louis. We didn't have no gauges to tell the pressure by, so when she started in to pant, we just hoped for the best and throw on some more wood. I guess your average steamboat pilot was the most talkative man alive. If he wasn't telling his own lies, he was listening to somebody else's. A good many pilots was kin to the owner of the boat, and they couldn't see a snag or a rock if it jumped out of the river and called them by their first name. Of course, the boats was all made of wood, so if we ran onto a snag, it was goodbye, Sarah Ann. In fact, the average life of a steamboat on the western rivers was less than 2 years, and in that one season, there was nearly 200 sunk or damaged. The fastest time anybody ever made from New Orleans to St. Louis that year was the time of the old Imperial. That did it in 4.5 days. We took close to 7, mainly because we had to burn up half the state of Arkansas to keep up a good wad of steam. 3 times a day we'd stop to wood up or maybe to set off some freight, and of course replenish the supply of drinking whiskey, which was dangerously low at all times.
For the experienced traveler, the frequent stops for wood offer a splendid opportunity to stretch one's legs and observe the native American in what might be termed his natural state. The settlements are no more than a few rude cabins surrounded by stacks of cottonwood cut to the size of the steamboat boiler and sold for $2 a cord. The most pretentious building is usually the saloon, where one may purchase a sample of the local beverage. Though the natives proclaim its virtues against the cholera and similar ailments, the English traveler would be well advised to decline the experience. On occasion, one may see emigrants from the more settled areas passing through on their way to the west. It is characteristic of the American to be a kind of nomad who will sell out and move on the slightest rumor of gold or free land somewhere else. In part, this may be attributed to the dull and brutish life which most Americans must endure. More than 80% of the population exist by farming the land. With small game to supplement their diet, they labor incredible hours to produce the bare necessities for survival. In a prosperous year, the small farms may produce a surplus which they market in St. Louis. The steamboat captain will dispose of the stock for a small commission, plus freight charges which run about 30 cents per hundredweight. With few exceptions, these verbal contracts are carried out with scrupulous honesty, the farmer receiving his money or goods on the next trip downriver. In this one respect, the Americans offer an example to the more civilized nations of the world.
We was only a day out of St. Louis when our boat was challenged to a race. Of course, it was foolishness, but boats with a go-ahead reputation made the biggest profits, so the captain would a sight rather be sunk than overtook. We tied down the safety valve and then stoked her up with turpentine and hog lard. The passengers was yelling to stoke her up hotter. Could they have seen the boiler plates moving in and out like a hound dog's flanks, there would have been a good deal less cheering and a considerable increase in religion.
We arrived in St. Louis on July 12, 1859. I could see immediately that the city was much grander. The captain informed us that the population now included 200,000 persons. The new dome for the courthouse was complete, and certainly it looked much more distinguished. The best hotels were no longer on the levee, and in their place was a mixture of saloons, commercial offices, and warehouse space. It was not extremely crowded, but during the season there were some 3,000 steamboat arrivals at St. Louis, and at times the boats were tied up 2 and 3 rows deep. It was my hope that all this evident prosperity would be reflected in the price I might expect for my sugar and my cotton. Certainly it appeared that St. Louis was the commercial center of the continent.
It must be admitted that our arrival was a matter of considerable surprise to me. After days of primitive scenery, I was astonished to discover this extraordinary metropolis at what may only be called the ends of the earth. Every comfort of civilized life seemed to be present. The constant activity was reminiscent of the docks at Liverpool or Southampton. I found myself becoming very curious about what sort of city this might be that contained such colorful life at its doorstep.
In the summer of 1859, St. Louis was the seaport of the West. To feed the pioneer economy, St. Louis sent up the Missouri lead shot, bagging, candles, ironware, glass, rope, tobacco, soap, shoes, whiskey, cotton cloth, and sugar. From the West, the raw materials came back: beef, wheat, hides, cornmeal, lead, lumber, furs, bacon, and hogs. Every year the trade increased, and every year there were more and more people coming upriver to settle here, or simply see for themselves the remarkable city that was hidden beyond the levee. In the summer of 1859, St. Louis was, in the opinion of most of its citizens, the most important city of the West. Now, the upstart Chicago was making noises, but they couldn't possibly compare to our natural advantages. We were the center of river transportation, of course. The discovery of iron ore in southern Missouri gave promise that we would soon rival Pittsburgh in that department. Our merchants had opened up the Santa Fe Trail. They still controlled most of the trade routes to the far west. Also in the far west, St. Louis capital had gone into the silver, gold, and copper mines, and the profits were flowing back. Now, in those days, men with nothing but a notion and a letter of introduction were making fortunes in St. Louis. For the thousands who came here on the riverboats, whether they were tourists or sober men of affairs, German immigrants or deckhands out for a night to howl, the city that lay beyond that levee was their western capital of opportunity. The official limit of the city was Grand Avenue, but the business district was all between 5th Street and the river. Above 5th, the residential section began and extended west to the new addition called Lucas Place at 14th and Locust. At 13th and Gratiot Street, the Mill Creek drained what was left of Chouteau's Pond, while a variety of factories and Irish shacks lined its bank. Broadway was then called 5th Street, while 4th Street near Locust had respectable banks on one end and gambling halls on the other. The first horse trolley was started that year by Erastus Wells, and it ran along Olive Street to 12th. The traffic problem was severe, and the papers warned of disaster unless something was done. Throughout the city, the signs of prosperity were unmistakable. On the levee, the Ward and Brady boat store was a center for those who came upriver to make their fortune.
I came to St. Louis as a boy with some large ideas about owning a steamboat. Since I had no money, I was kindly advised that it might take me a few weeks to make my first $1 million, and perhaps I should get some experience in a more humble capacity. That seemed sensible to me, and I decided I might give someone the opportunity of hiring me on a temporary basis. At that time, the best way to find a job was to walk up 4th Street and ask if anybody needed a boy. I finally had some luck at 4th and St. Charles. My salary was $2 a week and board. I would arrive at 5 a.m., and we didn't put up the shutters till 10 at night. William Barr was the manager, and our main competitor was McClellan and Scruggs. We did do some advertising in those days, and of course the competition did the same. My next job was at 4th and Locust, where I got $3 a week for helping out in a picture studio. One fellow there had pretty romantic ideas about himself, but his partner was a sensible man. It was a great opportunity to meet all the important men of the city. There was Captain Dozier, Captain J.C. Swan, Mr. James Lucas, Colonel John O'Fallon, Henry Shaw, and Mayor Weimer. At the time, I was pretty impressed with the company I kept.
The most popular hotel of the day was the Planter's House at 4th and Pine, the first stop for every traveler who read his Baedeker guide.
My room was pleasant enough, though the drinking water was more nearly mud than liquid, and I set out to establish my credit at the Boatman's Savings Institution. The principal newspaper is the Republican, which oddly enough supports the Democrats. At 5th and Locust there is a mercantile library and a rather imposing high school at 15th and Olive. The St. Louis University is located at 9th Street and Washington Avenue, and further on there is a new school called Washington University at 17th Street in the country. Their president is a certain Dr. Elliott, whom I found surprisingly erudite. The most intriguing school is Dr. McDowell's Medical College on 8th Street. There was at the time a great outrage about the use of bodies for medical dissection. And the doctor, who was a very strange man indeed, ordered his faculty and students to drill with a brass cannon in order to protect his bodies from the mob. I was invited to visit Bonham Seminary, which is an admirable institution devoted to the education of young females. And though their accent is deplorable, I must say I found them quite charming. They prevailed upon me to read my poem about St. Louis. Golden city in a dark and dreary land, your destiny is greater than you know, for in future days that history is planned, your star shall rise and ever glow. One of the most attractive places in St. Louis is the estate of Henry Shaw. He calls it Tower Grove and has established a public garden there after the fashion of the one at Chatsworth near Sheffield. On the way back to my hotel, I stopped briefly at Lafayette Park. It is the oldest in the city, and one hopes it is a fair omen of the future, when progress and civilization shall wholly transform this savage land.
After 2 months on the river, I come off the boat with a month's pay in me pocket, a terrible pain in me stomach, and me hair falling down like Spanish moss. The hair was fixed easily enough, and I inquired after an apothecary who could be trusted with me delicate condition. Fortunately, there was one, and I soon found myself looking over his stock of remedies. I didn't like the sound of one, and another showed Frederick the Great, but I knew nothing at all about the state of his stomach. Parker's tonic showed the before and the after, but sure you had to look twice to see which was which. Now, the last I might have bought, but I couldn't decide whether I had St. Vitus dance or locomotor ataxia, so I gave it up entirely and went for my usual remedy. I finally decided on Winkelmeyer's Best, and though I don't have much to say for the Dutchman ordinarily, in this case me stomach was a traitor to me politics and approved the cure. After a bit, I felt good enough to stop at the Capitol Oyster House for a dish of their best. Me next visit was the old Varieties Theater at 5th and Market. There were some speeches from that poet the English are so proud of, and a midget called Tom Thumb who was about the size of your hat. Next, a German lady sang in Italian about some Spaniard who left her, and of course we all applauded his decision. The feature was two mystical sisters who claimed they could get in touch with the spirits of the departed. Well, I'm not superstitious by nature, but I thought I'd better leave before the conversation got started. And just to safeguard me health, I returned for a little more of the remedy. I was just going back to the hotel when I had the great good fortune to witness a splendid alarm. As it turned out, it was my hotel that had made such a brave and splendid sight. And since the fire department had had its usual success, there was nothing for it but go back to the river, which I did.
A century ago, a simple fire might spread to destroy half the city, and the pain in a man's stomach might be the beginning of plague. Those dangers seem remote now, and the life very strange. But there were some things about the city in 1859 which require no explanation at all. For a small boy of the time, the blacksmith was a great man. And though his occupation has mostly vanished, much of the other work a man might do still seems familiar. For some in St. Louis, change was welcome. But for a Creole planter visiting a house that still stands at Cherokee and Broadway, change was another matter.
I was a guest of the Demenil family near Carondelet, and though they were kind, I could not escape the sadness the city gave me. On Mound Street, the great mound is being destroyed for the sake of a factory. The old Chouteau pond is gone, and the Chouteau mill is only a decadent relic. Their old home near Saint-Charles is now a place for a poor farmer. On North Main Street, the Magnet home contains a pack of children who run the streets to steal their bread. The Bienvenue house is for lease to the lowest kind of person. The old St. Louis is a ruin, and yet no one cares. Instead, the 50,000 Germans build their clumsy houses and speak of abolition, black republicanism, and their hatred for the South and our peculiar institution. My friends here fear for their slaves and their property, but I think they should be more afraid for their lives.
In the beer gardens of St. Louis, there were other men with very different feelings.
We had come from the old country to escape the kings who would make us slaves. Now there was men who would destroy our new country in order to keep their slaves, and that we could not permit. All that summer we sang of love and drank to peace. But when we talked, we spoke always of politics and our fear for war. It was a gentle time. The music was good, and we hoped for the best. But in our hearts we knew that something was coming to an end, that this would be the last summer for peaceful men.
The bright summer of 1859 was succeeded by the bleak winter of 1860. Lincoln was president-elect, and as he prepared to assume the presidency, one southern state after another prepared to secede. In that winter, it seemed certain that Missouri would be one of their number. She was a slave state, and the new governor, Claiborne Jackson, was an announced secessionist. But in St. Louis, a majority were opposed. It was not necessarily that all of them were Republicans or abolitionists, but they knew that a civil war would mean a disaster for the city. The river would be cut, or markets would be lost, or people would be divided against each other. And so always they spoke earnestly of concession and compromise. But on the 20th of December, the issue passed the talking stage. South Carolina seceded, and within a month, 6 other southern states had followed suit. In Jefferson City, Governor Jackson made open plans to force Missouri into the new Confederacy. And in St. Louis, where 15 years before the Dred Scott trial began, men who had spoken of compromise began to prepare for war.
We organized a committee of public safety at the courthouse in January 1861. Frank Blair spoke, and then came to the Turnhalle on South 10th Street to watch us drill. The Southerners had their headquarters at 5th and Pine. The Federal Arsenal was on South Broadway, where there was the biggest collection of guns in the West. We were determined that the South should not have them. In May of 1861, Governor Jackson called the state militia to meet at Lintel Grove and take the arsenal. Captain Lyon immediately ordered us to march up Pine and Olive and surround the camp. There were many secessionists in the city, and when we marched our prisoners down Olive, they tried to take them from us. 28 were killed, and there was no more talk of compromise.
For the next few days, the city was racked by street fighting, and General Harney proclaimed martial law. In 6 months, nearly 16,000 young men from St. Louis joined the Union Army. At the same time, 5,000 of their neighbors went south to join the Confederacy. Fairgrounds Park was turned into a Union training camp called Benton Barracks. And after the death of General Lyon, Fremont was appointed as commander-in-chief. At the urging of his wife, Jessie, he authorized the citizens of St. Louis to operate a hospital at 5th and Chestnut for the Union wounded. Around St. Louis, he built a network of fortifications, and Union troops moved south and west of the city to try and stop the bloody guerrilla warfare which erupted through the state. Professing formal allegiance to the South, the guerrillas robbed, murdered, and burned without much regard for whose side anybody was on. Union refugees flocked to the city, and their labor was soon absorbed in the efforts to supply the Union Army. In the shot towers of St. Louis, 40% of the Union ammunition was produced. Uniforms and shoes were manufactured here, and for 5 years, the city was an arsenal for the armies of Missouri and Tennessee. James Eads was a Union man, and at his boatyard in Carondelet, he began to design and manufacture a tool that would eventually break the southern hold on the river. Beginning in August of 1861, Eads' men built 7 gunboats in less than 100 days. They were nicknamed the Turtles and carried 13 heavy guns with 2-inch iron plate in front and heavy timbers to protect the sides. In December, they moved downriver to the Army base at Cairo, Illinois.
I was with the 17th Illinois at Cairo, and our commander was a young general by the name of Grant. His boss was General Halleck, who we used to call Old Brains. In December of '61, they had gathered a bunch of gunboats and broken down steamers, and the Army detached some of us to give the Navy a hand. In February of '62, our 4 gunboats and 17,000 men started up the Tennessee. The rumor was that we were going to attack Fort Henry and Donelson, but I didn't think too much of our chances. The gunboat crews were mainly saltwater sailors, few artillerymen from the Army, and a whole passel of farmers who had a uniform, but never seen a boat before. Most of the officers were young lieutenants, and they were long on enthusiasm, but not too high on experience. Somehow the idea of us going up to take a fort seemed a little sad. On February the 6th, the ball was commenced. We took Fort Henry in a day, and on the 14th of February, we attacked Fort Donelson.
On the afternoon of the 14th, the fort was cut off, and all the gunboats returned while Grant put his army to the attack. On the morning of the 15th, Confederate General Pillow launched a counterattack against the right flank of the Union Army. In a desperate fight, the Union lines held, and the 2nd Iowa began a second attack on the fort. On the 16th of February, Grant demanded and received the immediate and unconditional surrender of Fort Donelson. For the first time, Union men could see the possibility of victory in the West. In 1865, the war was over, the damage done. 4,000 young men of St. Louis were either killed or wounded. In addition, the city was divided by a wall of bitter memories. The Southerners could not forget the days of martial law when their property was forfeit and their homes invaded. The Northerners, on the other hand, found it hard to forgive those they considered most responsible for the great calamity. For 5 years, the city's normal business had been all but destroyed. During that time, its old southern markets had been lost, while transcontinental railroads and eastern capital moved north to Chicago, a safe distance from the dangers of war. And here, history had delivered an ironic judgment on St. Louis. The loyal city that had been most responsible for victory in the West, in the end paid the same price as its defeated enemies. And yet, despite the damage, when the war was finally over, the city began a vigorous, if belated, expansion. And once again, the steamboats led the way. At the end of the war, St. Louis still had faith in the possibilities of the steamboat. And St. Louis boat yards at Carondelet built some of the largest and most powerful packets ever seen on the river. At 100 pounds pressure, the engines could develop 2,800 horsepower. And under good conditions, they would steam at 20 miles an hour. Their paddle wheels were 40 feet high, and they carried, in addition to passengers, some 3,000 tons of freight. To compete with railroad service, the reluctant rivermen were forced into passenger-pleasing uniforms. And on some boats, they were even told to let passengers sit in the pilot house. They were the greatest steamboats ever built, but it wasn't enough. Within 10 years after the war, the railroads had built tracks that paralleled every branch and tributary of the river. Along the Missouri, the Ohio, and the Tennessee, the Arkansas, the White, and the Red, the Cumberland, the Monongahela, Illinois, and finally the Mississippi itself, the trains took the passengers and the freight. By 1870, St. Louis began to work away from the river. On 4th Street, the steamboat office was replaced by a railroad ticket agency, and passengers leaving town took the horse car west. At 12th and Poplar, the first Union Depot was the center of the city's new life and a symbol of its new taste for elegance. At 4th and Market, Dr. McLean put his patent medicine profits into artistic statuary. Profits from Civil War hardtack built Cracker Castle. And on 8th and Washington, the first Methodist Episcopal Church surprised everybody. The railroad age had arrived, and for the first time, St. Louis saw the river as an obstacle. According to the Wiggins Ferry Company and all reputable engineers, a railroad bridge at St. Louis was impossible. In 1867, Captain Eads began to build it, and by 1873, the steelwork was underway.
It was the Keystone Construction Company that had the job, and on each pier we built a false tower and then strung steel cables to support the arches till they come together in the middle. The arches themselves were made of steel tubes about 18 inches in diameter, and each one about 10 feet long. According to Captain Eads, when we put 1,000 of them together, we'd have a bridge. Of course, there was a multitude of people who hoped that never happened, including about half the population of Chicago. In order to close the first arch, we packed the steel tubes with 30,000 pounds of ice to make them smaller. Then we closed it up with a special tube that Captain Eads invented for the occasion. After 7 years of bad jokes about Eads' folly and the bridge coming down, it was a proud moment indeed. in all, the bridge cost over $9 million, and each of the steel arches covered more than a 500-foot span, the like of which had never been done before. On the 1st of July, 1874, we finished it. And for the next 10 years, there was engineers coming from all over the world to see what Jim Eads had done in St. Louis. It took 7 years to build that bridge, and 10 men died in the doing. But when it was finished, there wasn't a man who didn't brag about his part. On the opening day, Captain Eads put it this way: "I am justified," he said, "in declaring that this bridge will last as long as it is useful to the people who come after us, even if its years should number those of the pyramids."
For St. Louis, the new bridge was the symbol of its future. But for the steamboat man, it was an obstacle and a nuisance, the last insult in a long list of injuries. Their passengers stolen away, the lovely boats were loaded to the guards in a vain attempt to keep their freight. But when the river took its toll, there were no replacements. Instead, the railroads filled the advertising space, while the front page told of steamboat disaster.
I quit the river in '79 and took a job at the Fairgrounds Park in St. Louis. For a while, I worked for the fellow who rented out boats, and I finally made pilot when he left me run that little steamboat in a lagoon. In them days, there was a racetrack at the park, and in the first week of every October, there would be a big agricultural and mechanical fair. Racers and trotters would come from all over, plus just about every farmer for 5 states around. The grandstand was supposed to hold close to 100,000 people, but during fair week, there was standing room only. Outside the racetrack, there was about 90 acres of exhibitions, including the pavilions where St. Louis manufacturers showed their wares. It was always a great week for the city. The hotels were full up, and the railroads probably made a lot of money. But somehow, I always remembered how it was before the war, when people come by steamboat from every city on the river, and the levee was so crowded you could see the smoke 2 miles away. The fair was bigger now, but I couldn't help but think it was a whole lot better then.
It has been some 75 years since the city and the river came to a parting. In that time, of course, they have not been wholly separate. Steamboats still came to the levee as late as the 1930s. But for the city, they were mostly objects of curiosity, and the river itself became an obstacle to be crossed. or a place to get rid of the municipal sewage. Today, a century after the Civil War, St. Louis is again turning to the river. We have become, almost without knowing it, the center of modern towboat operations. Last year, these boats carried 20 times more tonnage than the steamboats did in their palmiest days. Thanks to the continuous efforts of the Corps of Engineers, a system of dikes and dredges such as the St. Genevieve here have opened a 9-foot channel from New Orleans to St. Paul. They have opened the Ohio, the Missouri, and the Tennessee. And once again, boats from Omaha, Cincinnati, Memphis, Vicksburg, and New Orleans are moving toward St. Louis. To welcome the new traffic, the city has itself built a $2.5 million addition to the municipal dock. And on the old levee, there is a promise of new life. The Jefferson Memorial Arch will again connect the river to the city. And around it, there will be new apartments where people will again know the river as a daily experience. The steamboat years are gone. But it is a reasonable prediction that in the years to come, this city will return to the river to acknowledge the unique quality of its past and to make the most of its future.
We hope you enjoyed the historic material in this presentation, which was made available as a public service by Laclede Gas through its video lending library. Laclede Gas, where public service is our daily business. Laclede Gas, 2,000 people bringing you energy that is comfortable, efficient, and virtually pollution